This lesson is about deductive reasoning, and there's two types of laws of logic that we're going to learn today. One is called the law of detachment, and that is if you're given P implies Q is true, and you know that P is true, this means that then Q has to be true. So if you know P implies Q is true, and then you know that the first part, P, is true, therefore Q is true too. So how it works is, if you're given a conditional statement, first identify the P and the Q. So if M is the midpoint of the segment, so that's P, then it divides the segment into two congruent segments. I should say segments, Q. So we know that this part is true. So we have P implies Q is true. Then we're given M is the midpoint of AB. So since AB is a segment, this is the same thing as saying M is the midpoint of a segment. So if we know that M is the midpoint of the segment AB, we can conclude that Q is true also. So we can conclude the blue part, that M divides the segment into two congruent segments. That's the law of detachment. So it really helps to underline the P's and Q's and see if you're given the P. If the P is true, then the Q is true. To me, the law of syllogism kind of works like the law, or works like the transitive property. So if you know that P implies Q is true, and Q implies R is true, we can bypass the Q's and say that P implies R has to be true. So again, I'm going to underline the same thing, the P's, the Q's, and the R's. So if a number is prime, we're going to call that P, then it does not have repeated factors. We're going to call that Q. If a number does not have repeated factors, which we just use that, does not have repeated factors. So we have does not have repeated factors again, so I'm going to still call it Q. And then it is not a perfect square. This is a new thing that showed up. It is not a perfect square is new. That's going to be R. It says, what can you conclude? Well, we have that P implies Q is true in the first statement right here. And then we have Q implies R is true in the second statement right here. So now let's get rid of the Q in the sentence. Get rid of the Q. So now we can just write P implies R. So I'm going to write it down right now. So I wrote if a number is prime, which was the P, then it is not a perfect square, which is the R. This is the P. This is the R. You can just totally get rid of the Q's. That's the law of syllogism. See how it's kind of like the transitive property? Sometimes you can even combine the two different laws. And I would always label the P's, Q's, and R's. And sometimes there's nothing to conclude. Logically, you can't say anything. So let's practice. So if the circus is in town, this is new, so we're going to call it P, or the first statement we call P. Then there are tents at the fairground. That's Q. If there are tents at the fairground, we just use there are tents at the fairground. So that was our Q. Then Paul is working as a night watchman. We haven't read anything yet that Paul is working as a night watchman, so that's R. So I have P implies Q. I have Q implies R. This is the law of syllogism. I can basically bypass these Q's. So I'm going to write it out. Okay, I wrote it out. If the circus is in town, that was P. Then Paul is working as a night watchman. That's R. I got rid of the Q. Don't need it. Okay, next, if a quadrilateral is a square, that's P, then it contains 4 right angles. That's Q. If a quadrilateral contains 4 right angles, okay, we already have that it contains 4 right angles, so we're going to call that Q. Then it is a rectangle. Haven't seen anything about a rectangle yet, so we're going to call that R. So we have P implies Q in their first sentence. We have Q implies R in our second sentence. So by the law of syllogism, we can say P implies R and cut out the Q's. So I'm going to write that. I wrote, it's hard to read though, if a quadrilateral is a square, then it's a rectangle. Number 5, if Robbie wants to buy a car, I'm going to let that be P, he must get a part-time job. That's Q. Robbie started a job at Forest Hills Foods. Well, that is basically our Q statement, because starting a job at Forest Hills Foods is working a job. So that's Q. So we have that P implies Q is true, and then we're given that Q is true. So is this the law of syllogism? No, because it doesn't look like the transitive property, and there's not an R. And it actually is not the law of detachment. The law of detachment says if P implies Q is true, and you're given P, then you conclude Q. But this one, you're given P implies Q is true, and then you're given Q. So you can't assume that Robbie wants to buy a car. He could want to buy a car for other reasons besides having a part-time job. The last one, if 2 figures are congruent, that's P, their areas are equal, that's Q. The area of ABCD equals the area of PQRS. So areas are equals is the same thing as the areas are equals of these 2 figures. So this is actually Q again. So we have that P implies Q is true, and we have Q. So what can we conclude? Well, that's not the law of syllogism. Number 4 is a law of syllogism, and it's actually not the law of detachment either. So in number 5, we write nothing. Forgot to write nothing. And then number 6, you write nothing. Nothing can be concluded. I'm going to keep working through these. If it does not rain, that's P. The track team will have practice, Q. If the track team has practice, which we just did was Q, the team members will warm up by jogging 2 miles, that's R. It does not rain on Thursday, so that's P. So we have that P implies Q is true, Q implies R is true. So we can combine these. This is a law of syllogism to say that P implies R is true. So we're given that it does not rain on Thursday, so then we know that R is true. So we know that the team members will warm up by jogging 2 miles. So your answer is the team members will warm up by jogging 2 miles. Number 8, if you live in Providence, P, then you live in Rhode Island, Q. If you live in Rhode Island, Q, you live in the smallest state in the U.S. That's new, that's R. Shannon lives in Providence. That matches up with you live in Providence. So again, you have P implies Q is true, Q implies R is true, and you're given that P is true. So that means that R must be true. So you conclude that Shannon lives in the smallest state in the U.S. You're basically combining the law of syllogism with the law of detachment. And number 9, if a person lives in Omaha, that's P, then he or she lives in Nebraska, that's Q. Gloria lives in Nebraska. Well, lives in Nebraska is Q. So we have P implies Q is true, and then we have Q is true. So this is not the law of detachment, because the law of detachment would have to say P implies Q, and then P is true, but we have Q. So again, you have to write nothing. Number 10, if you vacation at the beach, P, then you must like the ocean, Q. If you like the ocean, Q, then you like Florida. That's totally new, R. So we have that P implies Q is true, and Q implies R is true. So then, by law of syllogism, you can say P implies R is true. So your answer is, if you vacation at the beach, then you will like Florida.